Thank you all, and thank you MTSO for the invitation and the hospitality today. It really has been a joy to kind of be here and see your space. I've never been on this campus before, so it was wonderful to walk the fields and see the gardens and see the archives downstairs, so thank you. So today I'm gonna pose the question of what's in a name, particularly the name Methodist. Over the course of the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to dive into the histories and the origins and the meanings of the name Methodist. And hopefully, in the end, we will all leave with a renewed understanding, a renewed energy to reclaim Methodist in maybe its original form. Now, y'all, any good history starts with the stories of and voices of women. Any proper Methodist history starts with Susanna. The oh so methodical mother of John, Susanna was formidable. At the age of 19, she married Samuel Wesley, who was a priest in the Church of England. She gave birth to 19 children. Being raised in a dissenting household, a Puritan household, Susanna was raised to be skeptical of the Church of England. And her skepticism and strong will were passed on to her children. And quite famously, Susanna taught her daughters to read before she taught them to sew. Of this abnormal act, she wrote the following: "The putting children to learn sewing before they can read perfectly is the very reason why so few women can read fit to be heard and never to be well understood." Now, one of the more illustrative stories of Susanna's strong will happened in 1712. Samuel had just traveled to London to fulfill his duties as a priest and attend convocation, kind of what we might call annual conference. In his absence, he left his curate, or his associate, in charge. His curate's name was Inman. Susanna believed Inman to be a buffoon at best. So in order to ensure that the persons at Epworth were still spiritually cared for despite Samuel's absence, she began to invite friends, neighbors, congregation members, and included her servants to hear her preach on Sunday afternoons. Now, many of those living in the town began to share Susanna's sentiment and began to choose her services from her kitchen, held over the official ones on Sunday morning. Within a couple of weeks, she was soon preaching to over 200 people from her kitchen. You can all imagine how Inman felt about this, and Inman writes quickly to Samuel and says, "Do you know what your wife is doing?" And Samuel probably receives the letter and is like, "Lord, I don't know what she's doing, but I'm sure it is something wonderful." So Samuel writes to Susanna, and Susanna writes back and challenges Samuel's inquiry. She writes, oh no, did I break it? Did I turn it off? Suspense, there we go. She wrote, quote, "If you do, after all, think fit to dissolve this assembly, do not tell me anymore that you desire me to do it, for that will not satisfy my conscience. But send me your positive command in such full and express terms as may absolve me from all guilt and punishment for neglecting this opportunity of doing good to souls, when you and I shall appear before the great and awful tribunal of our Lord Jesus Christ." So in other words, I will stop if you absolutely command it, and if you're willing to take the blame for those lost souls on Judgment Day. Let's just say that Samuel did not follow up his request. Now, John is about 8 or 9 years old when Susanna is preaching to hundreds of people from her kitchen. And from his mother's example and through her ministry and witness, he realized that sometimes to truly reach people, you have to be willing to bend some rules. You have to bend rules in order to welcome people into the love of God. And sometimes this even calls for unsanctioned actions outside the walls of the church. It is in, from, and through Susanna's influence that John begins to build the core of what it would later mean to be Methodist. And one of this core aspect of our early identity that I want us to try to reclaim is something that I'm starting to call Wesleyan vitality. Not vitality, we aren't concerned with numbers, vitality. Vitality is that willingness to look beyond today's acceptable practices, standards, and norms, and bend the rules in order to ensure that more and more persons can be included within the kingdom of God. And that all persons, no matter who they are, how they identify, whom they love, or how they live, can know and experience the love of God, can know their own self-worth so that they can love others and themselves. Susanna preached the sense of Wesleyan vitality by simply embodying a female body and daring to preach in her own home. But she did so because she knew there were persons in need of the message of God's love, and fulfilling that commandment of God's is greater than any offense we might cross. And y'all, John soaks this in. It first comes out during his days at Oxford, right? That first rise of Methodism. When the moniker Methodist begins to be used, it was used to describe a group of about 4 or 5 people. Most of them were students. John was actually a fellow at Oxford, but all of them had some connection to the university. Now, I always like to say that John Wesley he'd already graduated, and he was hanging around campus trying to figure out what he was going to do with his life. Right? He was like that awkward alum who just won't go away and figure out their call. But his younger brother, Charles, was enrolled. And since John was trying to figure out what he's going to do, Charles begins this small group, this pietistic, Bible-centric group. And John sees it and says, I'm going to do that. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take over your group. And he did. So John, being John, takes over the leadership from his younger brother of this small group. And they quickly begin to be ridiculed for their way of doing religion. They rose early, they studied scripture intently, they prayed incessantly, they fasted, they talked openly about their spirituality, they visited the sick, and then they held each other accountable to all of this. In other words, this group began to center their lives on faith as love acted out. And in the 18th century context, this was really weird. Most people, if they went to church or were welcomed into a sanctuary, they sat down, listened to some scripture, tried to stay awake through a sermon, and then left. There was nothing required of them except filling a seat in the pew. And even then, that privilege was only reserved for a select few persons. Those who had the proper dress to feel comfortable entering the sanctuary, those who had geographical access to a parish, and those who had the luxury to take Sunday morning off from their labor. In the 18th century, the idea of faith existing beyond the walls of a church was anathema. The idea of faith being something that was lived, acted out, embraced, embodied, that started to challenge the status quo. And at a place like Oxford, it's not only these prior named disciplined acts of social transgression that started to make these Methodists weird. It was also their willingness to break the political norms of the day by leaving the walls of the city and going beyond them to where the people were, the poor, the outcast, the imprisoned. And they not only breached those physical walls, but they transgressed the religio, political, and social boundaries of whom was deemed worthy of God's love. They began to preach with these folks, to minister with them, to ask them what their spirit needed. For this, John and his friends were called many things. Names such as Bible moths, sacramentarians, and the Holy Club were all tossed around, all of them with a very derisive connotation. But in the past few years, British Methodist historian Peter Forsyth has found what he believes to be the earliest written, published use of the term Methodist to describe John Wesley and this group. It's printed in the Fogg's Weekly Journal, which was an Oxford newspaper, in December of 1732. After listing the various rules and routines of this group, the story goes on to state the following about them. As these Methodists have occasioned no small stir in Oxford, so there has not been a wanting variety of conjectures about them. And as several would be desirous to know our opinions of their rise, it may not be improper to acquaint you with them, which are summed up in these few lines of Ennius. The Latin, which then is below, ChatGPT, or the lovely robots that we now have access to, translate it as the following. It says, "They are not divine by knowledge or by skill, but are superstitious prophets, shameless diviners, or madmen. They are those whom poverty compels." So in the context of this article, we see that Methodists are being talked about because they're causing no small stir. When you look at what was going on in Oxford in November and December of 1732, Methodists began doing one thing that would have caused no small stir. Through the suggestion of William Morgan, the Holy Club began visiting local prisons and doing ministry with those in prison. Most of the time, they would take food, drink, medicine, occasionally reading materials to those, but they would sit down and have conversation with them. They would ask them about their bodily, physical, spiritual needs. They would pray with them, sing with them, and hold services for them. When they saw inhumane treatment directed at those who had no other options before them, the Holy Club took it upon themselves to hold authorities accountable. And every now and then, their actions went a bit further, and they used their legal expertise to advocate legally on behalf of a select few persons. This was the case when John Wesley and John Clayton, fellow Holy Clubber, took an interest in one inmate named Thomas Blair. Now, Blair was an inmate at the Bocardo prison. He was on death row for what was, at the time in the 18th century, a capital offense. Mr. Blair was accused of having a sexual relationship with another man. Wesley and John Clayton believed that Blair was being victimized even further by his inmates and the guards because of his alleged crime. From correspondence between John Wesley and John Clayton, we see how they sought to marshal his evidence and convince any reasonable person of Blair's innocence. The day of Blair's trial, Wesley rose at 4 a.m. and rode 12 miles on a horse to be present. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Blair was found guilty, but his life was spared, and he was fined about 20 marks, which is about 5,000 pounds in today's standards. Unable to raise this money to release himself, who do you all think raised the money to get him out? John Wesley. A no small stir indeed. Now, there are many things that people take away from this story. One thing that we can definitely take away is that John Wesley was also deemed guilty in the public's eye through his ministry with and association with Blair. Now, I'm not saying, and we can't say for sure, that Wesley was defending the actions of Blair, but he was also not condemning him for them either. Wesley was concerned with how Blair was being treated by others. He knew that Blair, for the crime that the papers called too indelicate to mention, would be targeted for multiple forms of harassment, and Wesley knew that was wrong. So in order to ensure that Blair felt worthy of God's love, of the love of neighbor, and love of himself, Wesley was willing to risk all. Peter Forsyth, the historian who found this article, describes this unrelenting, unconditional defense of all persons as the act of public witness that tipped the balance between the Methodists being tolerated and being castigated. After their defense of Blair, the Holy Club began to be ridiculed even more for their way of doing religion, for their method that began to upend the norms and bend the rules by living out that love of God through intentional outreach to those most in need. And Forsyth powerfully concludes his article with the following: Wesley and his Oxford friends' eccentricities might be tolerated. Their excessive religious observance, their closed group intensity, their self-denial and strict code of living reminiscent of some of the wayward Puritan days of the previous century. Even their lowering themselves to undertake good works in the prisons and the workhouse was not beyond the pale. But it seems when they took up the advocacy of a man accused of sexual crimes, they crossed the boundary between the bizarre but tolerable to the reprehensible. Now, in 2024, as a person asking the question, what's in a name? What does it mean to be Methodist? I find it striking we don't know this story. In case it hasn't been clear, the article that is printed in the Oxford newspaper, which ridiculed Wesley for causing this no small stir surrounding Blair, is the first time, the earliest time we have found thus far, that the word Methodist is used to describe John Wesley in this group. This is how we got our name. This is what it means to be Methodist. And this is the message of God's love of all persons, no matter what, that we Methodists need to reclaim. Now, after Oxford, John continues to struggle with how to live into his peculiar and particular call. A few years later, on May 24th, 1738, we all know that John Wesley was finally assured of God's love of himself when he felt his heart strangely warmed. And while he was assured of God's love, he knew he didn't want to be a parish priest like his father. So what does he do? He experiments around a little bit, but this is where the story of Bristol, or the town of Bristol, comes into play. Now, today's time really isn't that different from Bristol, from 18th century England. Many of the people in the 18th century might have used our labels of nuns and duns to identify themselves. They were tired of the institutional church because they didn't see the institutional church meeting their everyday need. And they saw a church that refused to change in order to meet that need. People were expected to pay taxes to support the church, but they weren't seeing the return on their investment. Now, the national landscape of England was broken up into parishes, and for centuries, the parish system had functioned reasonably well. However, across the 18th century, industrialization is beginning, and people start moving from pastoral economies to industrialized economies. They go from their family farms, where everything that they need to live and survive is there, to urban settings. And under this population shift, the parish system collapses. It's underserved in rural areas and overserved or overused in urban areas. The collapse of the parish system provides that space for early Methodists to come in and evangelize and expand as they filled in those gaps of need. They provided education, medicine, orphanages, housing, all of these things that the communities were lacking. And so from the very beginning, the itinerant commission demands that we go to those places that are most collapsed, where life is most vulnerable and most disordered. And this is where John Wesley is introduced to the city of Bristol. Now, Bristol is a seaport town, and in Wesley's day, it was an important port in the Atlantic slave trade. It was the second largest city behind London and was the birthplace of what would become the Industrial Revolution. It produced everything from soap to chocolate to cannons, and it's surrounded by coal mines. It is massively overcrowded. Its walls were built to hold about 5,000 people, and by the 1750s, about 40,000 people were living inside its city walls. It lacked a sanitation system and was known as the dirtiest town in all of England. So Wesley gets called to Bristol in late March of 1739 by his longtime frenemy, George Whitefield. George Whitefield had been in this city for a while, preaching to ever-increasing crowds, and he calls on John for help. John arrives on March 31st and is kind of astounded to find Whitefield preaching to thousands, not inside of a church, but in the fields. John goes and does what he does best, and he writes in his journal, "I scarcely could reconcile myself at first to this strange way of preaching in the fields." You see, up until this point, John had at least followed the preaching standards of his day. He writes, "I had been all my life, till very lately, so tenacious of every point relating to decency and order that I should have thought the saving of souls a sin if it was not done inside of a church." I guess they really didn't read Sermon on the Mount. By April 2nd, right, just 2 days after his arrival, John does something he thought he never would. At 4 p.m, I submitted to be more vile and proclaimed in the highways the glad tidings of salvation, speaking from a little eminence in the ground adjoining to the city to about 3,000 people. Now, John is being particular when he uses the word vile here. He used that word a lot, but rarely did he admit to submitting to being vile. So he is intentionally using this word. And he's using it to show how he knows he's breaking rules. He knows he's going against the standards of the church or the decorum of society. But John is doing more than just breaking the rules of where you're supposed to preach in a church or in a field. It just so happens that these parishes each had their own bishop. Before you preach in a parish, you're also supposed to get the permission of the bishop. John didn't do that either. So when the parish bishop writes the next day and says, "I hear that you were around here preaching in the fields and you did not tell me you were coming here," this is when John Wesley writes that often quoted, "Sir, I look upon the world as my parish." He's using that phrase to show that he's knowingly and directly violating church law and overlooking the human-made boundaries of the institutional church in order to take God's love to those who needed it. Thousands of persons who gathered to hear Wesley were mostly coal miners. Various journals of the day describe the streaks of tears showing white skin beneath ash-covered faces. And many of them, for the first time, were hearing that somebody loved them, that God loved them, that they were worthy. Y'all, Wesley in this moment is being transgressive, yet prophetic. My colleague, David Worthington, who serves as the director of he's our global ambassador for Methodist Heritage Sites, brilliantly states that while John Wesley's heart was strangely warmed in London, it was set afire in Bristol. So within 3 days of being in Bristol, Wesley's entire framework of how to preach, where to preach, and what is proper versus what might be missionally prophetic is wholly overthrown. This experience of submitting to be vile, of preaching outdoors, shook his foundational understanding of normativity, of acceptability, and replaced them with a desire to follow the Spirit of God and meet people wherever they were. 1 month after preaching in a field of Bristol, John breaks ground in Bristol on the New Room, the first Methodist building in the world. I want to spend a second and look at that word vile again, because it is important to understand what we mean by that term. Now, sometimes when I've given this talk, people hope that the word vile is one of those kind of magic English words that meant something completely different 200 years ago. It didn't. In Wesley's day, just like in ours, vile meant something that was morally reprehensible, unpleasant, or foul. Vile acts were seen as repulsive and disgusting. So why am I up here suggesting we all become more vile? Well, in the context of Wesley's submission to be more vile, he isn't doing so just for the sake of getting a headline. He uses this word to describe that preaching in the fields was not something he wanted to do, nor chose to do. He felt called by God to go there, and he saw the effect of the preaching. He saw that the love of God was being brought to people who had not yet heard it. And if spreading the love of God required Wesley to do something that he considered reprehensible, he would do it. He was willing to make himself uncomfortable, to leave behind the norms of society, the standards of preaching, the standards that he, as an Oxford Don, had long conformed to, because they were people who needed to know of God's love. So what are you willing to do to spread the love of God? Will you make yourself uncomfortable? Will you break your own rules or the standards of society? Will you disobey or bend the rules of church law to reach those outside our walls? To make this point a little further about John's vitality, I want to share a couple more episodes. So in 1742, John returns to his boyhood home of Epworth. He immediately goes to St. Andrew's Parish, the parish of his late father, the parish where he was raised, baptized, and conformed and nurtured in the Anglican faith. Upon arrival, he asks the curate if he can assist with the morning service. And the curate says, "Oh, no, we want nothing to do with you, Methodist." However, word gets around that John is in town, and people show up kind of expecting to hear him. Instead, they hear the curate preaching against John Wesley's enthusiastic and happy form of religion. Around 6 p.m., out of respect, John looks around and finds the one piece of property that belongs to his family on the property of St. Andrew's Parish, his father's grave. And he stands atop his father's grave because he cannot be physically removed from it because it is his family's property, and preaches his message of unconditional love and happiness in God. John was also willing to be a bit more vile when it came to challenging institutions of his day. John is first exposed to the institution of slavery while living in the American colony of Georgia in the mid-1730s, and he's reminded of it in Bristol in the late 1730s. Later in his life, he writes Thoughts upon Slavery. It's one of the first tracts written by a white person condemning the white-controlled institution. And Wesley condemns it, in particular, the American form of chattel slavery. In his early commentary, he calls slavery out as a system which deemed and degraded persons from Africa as lesser, as somehow justified as property based on no other quality except from where they were kidnapped. Furthermore, in this tract, Wesley recognizes how the institution of slavery would affect Black persons for generations to come, preventing them from being recognized and treated as equals. He argued that enslavers had deprived Africans of any and all means of improvement and blamed the creation of social inequities not on Africans, but on white persons. And Wesley was not just against slavery in word, but in practice. When John Wesley forms the Methodist societies in the 1740s, he does not allow enslavers to be members. And we've heard specifically in his general rules, he names and calls out slavery as a way of doing harm. And in fact, according to late Methodist historian Bobby McLean, John Wesley, when he's over in Georgia and gets his heart broken by Sophie Hopkey, does not deny her communion because of his broken heart, but denies her communion because she married an enslaver. Now, the stance against slavery was initially continued beyond Wesley's British Methodist movement into the Methodist Episcopal Church when it's formed in 1784. However, the stance does not last long. It doesn't last more than 6 months. And the Methodist Episcopal Church continues to compromise with slavery year after year. And this is one of those first instances where we see the institutionalized church lose that sense of vitality that Wesley was so good at. Later in John Wesley's life, kind of despite his mother's influence and her brilliant theologian brain, John's willingness to let women preach took a little bit longer. It wasn't until the 1750s where he really comes around to licensing women to preach. But he finally comes to the conclusion that the Spirit of God falls upon women and men equally and begins to issue preaching licenses. One of the first women to receive these was Mary Bossum-Catt. She preached to often large crowds, and in the 1760s, she and Mary Ryan established Cross Hall. It's a Christian community center which housed and educated children and destitute adults. Along with preaching and Bible study, they offered services including medical care. Of her own preaching, she states the following, and this is one of my favorite quotes of women preaching. "I am conscious how ridiculous I must appear in the eyes of many for so doing. Therefore, if some persons consider me an impudent woman and represent me as such, I cannot blame them. Besides, I do nothing but what Mr. Wesley approves. And as to reproach thrown by some on me, what have I to do with it but quietly go forward saying, I will still be more vile if my Lord requires it." All right. It's too long to put on a t-shirt, or I would have a t-shirt. A final example of John's kind of pushing the boundaries and embracing this vitality led to the direct formation of the Methodist Episcopal Church. In 1784, not having the institutionalized power to ordain others, John takes it upon himself to ordain Richard Watcote and Thomas Vassie, and sends them along with Thomas Coke to the Americas to ordain Francis Asbury. So the picture that is now on the screen isn't of John ordaining Watcote and Vassie, but it's Thomas Coke ordaining Asbury. But in this one move, in this action of violating church law to implement ordination, John Wesley breaks apostolic succession and directly violates some of the more sacred laws of the Church of England. But again, he does so because he feels called by God to do it. And he knew that especially after the American Revolution, if the message of Methodism, of God's love of all persons, of happiness in God, was going to grow, he had to let go. And this was not an easy thing for him to do. And we can see that through the letters and the rather tense relationship between Asbury and Wesley that brewed over the next decade. The point of all of this is that after Bristol, after the first time when Wesley submits to be more vile, he develops a new ecclesiology for the people called Methodist. They were going to do church differently. The question is how? Luckily, John Wesley was an avid writer. And in 1742 and 1745, he takes pen to paper. He writes The Character of a Methodist and Advice to the People called Methodist. And it is through these two treatises of Wesley's that I think we can really learn of his hopes for the people called Methodist. Now, for a little bit of context, in the 1740s, Wesley is trying to piece together a unified missional movement in the midst of a mass chaos as to who's Methodist and who wasn't. All Methodists during this time were being ridiculed, harassed, beaten, jailed, and disowned from their families. There were Methodists who followed George Whitefield and believed that God's love was conditional and salvation selective for only a few persons. And there were Methodists who followed John Wesley, who was adamantly opposed and believed that God's love was universal and salvation for all. In the midst of this, John is trying to balance ridicule from the institutional church for his message. And so he turns to writing treatises to try to defend and define what he means by Methodist. He begins with the character of a Methodist, and this is one of my favorite entries into one of Wesley's treatises because he did not like the name Methodist, and he makes it very clear in this treatise. He begins by acknowledging the history of the term, which is spoken against everywhere, and then continues to state, quote, "I would rejoice if the name were buried in eternal oblivion and never mentioned again." Recognizing that was probably not likely to happen, he continued, "But if that cannot be, at least let those who use the term know the meaning of the word they use. Let us not always be fighting in the dark. Come and let us look one another in the face. Perhaps some of you who hate what I am called will love what I am and what I do by the grace of God." So John begins this treatise stating what a Methodist is not. First, a Methodist is not, or the distinguishing marks of a Methodist are not their opinions of any sort. They're assenting to any system of religion. They're embracing any particular set of ideas. They're accepting the teaching of one person or another. All of this is beside the point. He continued, and he keeps going for pages naming what we are not, that we are also not known by our way of speaking, nor any form of worship, nor rituals, nor any specific doctrine. So what are Methodists known by? Love. A Methodist is one who has the love of God shed abroad in their heart by the Holy Ghost given unto them. One who loves the Lord their God with all their heart, all their soul, all their mind, and all their strength, and God is the joy of their heart and the desire of their soul. Methodists are also known by happiness. He continues and says that Methodists are distinguished from other sects because they are, quote, happy in God. They are happy because they have an understanding that perfect love has cast out fear, and so they can rejoice. And hope. Methodists are persons who are full of hope, persons who unconditionally love all of humankind and seek to act upon that love because they believe that good is the will of the Lord. When I think about what it means to be Methodist, what makes us what's our distinguishing mark today, I often think back to right after General Conference this past May, I was asked to be a guest on an NPR show called On Point. If you've ever been a guest on an NPR show, sometimes there's preparation and sometimes there's not. This was one of those times where there was no preparation. I was told that I would be on live the next day, and the general topic would be the history of the Methodist Church and General Conference. Beth joined me on that On Point interview and did way better than I did. And we were also told, I don't know if you were told, I was told to keep my answers to under 90 seconds, which as a historian, that is not enough time for even context. So I get on this show, it's being recorded live, there's no opportunity for edits, and one of the questions I'm asked is, what makes United Methodist different from all other Protestant sects? That's a good question. It's a real good question. And as I am talking and words are coming out of my mouth and I'm trying to figure out what I exactly want to say that would be so poignant, I was thinking about how others also might answer this question. Right? Some of us might point to the different types of grace that are constantly and continuously working in and through us. Some might point to our connectional system, which allows us to minister in really unique ways by combining and connecting our resources. Others might point to our membership in various parts of the world. But what always brings me comfort when asked those particular questions is that history usually provides us an answer. And John Wesley was asked this same question in his day, and he answers it in this tract. So in his conclusion, he states, "If anyone says, 'Why, these marks are only the common fundamentals of all of Christianity,' they are indeed correct. I know they are. I declare to God, to you, and all people that I and all who follow my judgment do adamantly refuse to be distinguished from others by nothing more than the common principles of Christianity. The plain, old Christianity that I teach, renouncing and detesting all other marks of distinction." But he didn't stop there. He continues, and he says that for Wesley, while Methodists were Christians through and through, they were also this. And a Methodist is a Christian not in name only, but in heart and in life. They are inwardly and outwardly conformed to the will of God as revealed in Scripture. They think, speak, and live according to the method laid down in the life of Jesus Christ. Their soul is renewed according to the image of God in righteousness and in all true holiness. And having the mind that was in Christ, they walk as Christ walked, and by these marks, by these fruits of a living faith, we seek to distinguish ourselves from the unbelieving world and from all those whose minds or lives are not in accord with the gospel of Christ. So what is our distinguishing mark? From this, I would say Methodists are persons who act. Our faith compels us not towards opinions, but our faith compels us towards acting out God's love in this world. What matters is not our opinions or our forms of worship. What matters is, can you and I walk hand in hand out into this world and proclaim God's love? And while these characteristics helped John Wesley define or get a better handle on what a Methodist was, they didn't necessarily mean that Methodists were suddenly accepted. This is where, I'm going to skip forward for time's sake, this is where he writes his second treatise, Advice to the People, called Methodist. He writes this only a few years later, after Methodists are being harassed and beaten and jailed. And in this treatise, he seeks to provide points of advice to encourage the people called Methodists to keep on, to keep going, to keep being vile for the sake of God's love. And these 5 pieces of advice I want to offer to us as conclusion of how we can continue to really live into what it means to be Methodist. The first is, you are a new people. Wesley reminded his followers that they were new in name, in principle, and in practice. Y'all, United Methodist, especially after this general conference, could be a new people. We have one of those moments where we have the opportunity to pivot, to rebrand, to reclaim United Methodism as new. Throughout the 19th century, there are approximately 12 splits within the Methodist Episcopal Church. And in the 20th century, many of these came back together to form what we now call the United Methodist Church. But in these transitional moments, one thing is really clear. We rarely took advantage of these moments to really figure out and to boldly and proudly proclaim our identity, our mission, and our space in this world. Right? Think back to your Methodist history classes when the AME Zion, the Methodist Protestants, the Wesleyan Methodists, when all of them chose to leave the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church did not change. It refused to do so out of fear of losing more members. And when you let numbers and fear drive mission, the mission is fruitless. We have before us now that moment to be hope-filled, prophetic, vile, bold, to rethink who we want to be in the future. We can be proactive, even prophetic. The question is, are we brave enough to do it? And this is where Wesley's second piece of advice comes in handy. And it is my favorite piece of advice ever given by anybody. We have to remember to not be afraid to offend people. John Wesley and those at Oxford were given many monikers for their weird way of doing religion. But the name that stuck was Methodist. And we cease to be Methodist when we forget that our name at first was an insult. An insult for challenging the norms of society and breaking down the social and political boundaries that kept inequality in existence. Not everyone is going to like who we are or what we're doing or what we're saying, but we have to be willing to make people a little bit uncomfortable, open ourselves up to critique. Because y'all, if you're really following the love of God, you're gonna be kind of weird. You're gonna stick out. You're gonna irk the right people. People who joined the Methodists were disowned and disparaged because they challenged the norms. And I am not up here saying we should just be offensive and vile for the sake of being offensive and vile. Please don't get me wrong. But how do we be prophetically offensive? How do we dare to love God and spread God's love in such ways that might irk certain people to their core? How do we praise people who do ministry differently, who think outside the box and the walls of the church? How do we talk about things that get people talking about us in a public and secular realm? Look at what those Methodists are doing. And this is where John Wesley's third and fourth points come in handy and go together. They offer us a moment of comfort. For the Lord does not ask us to do anything that we cannot do, because God is always with us and anything is possible with God. All of this struggle, strife, and ridicule will be worth it in the end because we will be living a life of inward and outward holiness. And finally, Wesley advises his people to not complain, to not suffer openly about their ridicule, and to not condemn those who offer critique. He says quite poignantly, instead of talking of the wickedness of persons, you might talk of the goodness of God. Y'all, being Methodist isn't some radical, mind-blowing, theologically dense concept. It's really actually quite simple. It is faith acted out as love. Wesley reminds us of this in his often quoted sermon on the Catholic spirit. And these are the words that I want us to leave with today. But although a difference in opinions or modes of worship may prevent an entire external union, need it prevent our union in affection. Though we cannot think alike, may we not love alike. May we not be of one heart, though we are not of one opinion. Without all doubt we may. Herein all the children of God may unite, notwithstanding these smaller differences. These remaining as they are, Methodists forward one another in love and in good works. Thank you. I am willing to take a couple questions if there are any. I think we have like 7 minutes.
What do you see as what the future holds with social media? What would John Wesley say about evolutions there?
So this is one of those really fun places where I love to think that John Wesley would be all over virtual church, like virtual reality experiences of worship, using Facebook to live stream services. You know, we're live streaming here, and because that's where people are, and you go where people are. You have to adapt ministry to be where people are. Now, having said that, he would not like the gossip that goes on and the trolling that goes on social media. And so he would have had opinions about that. But I do think if we are truly being adaptive in the way that Methodists experimented so much and constantly changed how they were doing ministry in order to adapt to changing societies. Right? So we always think about the bands, classes, and societies. Those didn't form in a nice trajectory. Right? He knows societies exist because his dad was part of a society, he was part of a society, and then he kind of learns about classes, and then he learns about bands, and he kind of puts them all together in this system that worked. But it took decades to figure that out. And I think we're in a similar moment of transition where we just have to figure out how to adapt our ministry and our ecclesiology to changing technology. But I think Wesley would be all over. I mean, he would have been preaching on Facebook before it had the go live button, probably.
Hi. Hi. So practically speaking, how could we as a denomination be prophetically vile in a positive way for our culturally unique churches and use that same energy from General Conference in favor of our clergy of color too?
Oh, man, that's a good question. Oh, seminaries, whenever I do this talk at seminaries, I always get much harder questions than at annual conferences. No, I think that, if we're going to kind of be prophetically offensive or vile, we have to find ways and spaces to do church outside of the box, really, right? Like a lot of fresh expressions might be considered, preaching in the field or modern day field preaching. But, I would love to see how do we, instead of focusing on people coming to a sanctuary on Sunday morning, how do we instead focus on forming community? And not necessarily with the intent of evangelizing or bringing or saving people, but how do we just form community for the sake of doing mission, for the sake of bringing people together? And I think that's one of those spaces where, when you look at early Methodism, that's exactly what they were doing. They were bringing together bands because people didn't have community. They needed someone to check in on them. And so if we can do that, especially kind of given kind of the disconnected world that we live in, we're all instantly connected but very disconnected. So how do we intentionally form micro communities that focus on holding one another together in love, and not on unhealthy forms of accountability, but on healthy forms of holding one another in love? I don't know if that answers, okay.
So you named in the splits, we didn't take advantage of Become a New Church. Is there any evidence in the reunifications, if we ever did that? Is there any lessons in the coming, so no.
The mergers almost make it worse because we refuse to have the hard conversations needed, right? So the conversations between the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South about merger, reunifying, began, I think, in like 1869. It was pretty close right after the Civil War ended. And it's not, they don't come together until 1939. So that's in a generation or two of preachers who are still trying to figure out how do we come back together. And when they were having those conversations about merger, particularly the 1939 one, the idea of full racial inclusion was never on the table. It was always about, what do we do with Black Methodists? Do we put them in their own denomination like the South did? Do we put them in their own annual conferences like the North did? What do we do? How do we segregate Black Methodists? And if we were really having these Wesleyan conversations, we would talk about how do we fully integrate and be that vile example in the midst of the Jim Crow South, right? Like, how do you challenge and set the example of really showing unity? And so that's one of those spaces where in 1939, we did not have that conversation. Instead, it was all about power and money and fear. And in 1968, it's largely the same, right? The central jurisdiction is dissolved, and it's assumed that with the dissolution of the central jurisdiction, racism went away, right? We did it, we erased it. And instead it was subsumed into the shadows of our jurisdictional structure. And you know, one of the kind of, it's not really a rubric, but it's one of those things in history and in academia that's hard to prove because there's no magic paper that just says it. But 1968, between the creation of Black Methodists for Church Renewal and the General Commission on Religion and Race, it was believed that at the 1972 General Conference, there was going to be a true discussion of race and racism and holding Methodists accountable. And instead, in 1972, there was an intentional pivot towards sexuality so that the conversation on race never happened.
That's to the point of my question, really, is like, how do we re-energize that conversation for our culturally unique churches?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that is one of those questions where having the conversations at the local church level, being willing to be vulnerable with each other and open up and name past harm and hold ourselves accountable has to happen. And it's not a one and done, right? It's a continuous process. You know, we often talk about reconciliation, and our goal is always reconciliation. We want to apologize and get back together and be okay. There's a lot of repenting that has to happen before that can even be a conversation. And that's one of those places and spaces where we haven't done it for our racist acts, we haven't done it for our colonial and our settler acts, and we haven't done it for our heterosexist acts either. And so that conversation has to happen.
With the average high school student reading less than one book before they graduate and long-form videos being too long for Generation Z and Generation Alpha, how do you think that our Methodist heritage, our history, our beliefs, our Wesleyan theology is going to be carried into the future?
In very quick, short segments. I have experimented with, I tried to open a TikTok account for the General Commission and be dorky yet informative on TikTok. Me and John, I have a cardboard cutout of John Wesley. It's life size. And we went, he was about 5'3", 5'4". I took him on, at the Youth 2023 event, so last summer, I took him on a date each night at the Youth 2023 event, and we walked on the beach and talked theology. We watched reruns of The Office and talked about workers' rights or something. I don't know what I liked it. But I was trying to find creative snippets to get people's attention in order to teach them something. And while I hope that's not the future of academia, but I do think that there's something to be said about finding ways to capture people's attention in order to teach them something. And if you have to do it by being dorky at first, then be dorky. I mean, that's kind of my shtick, is being a dorky.
It seems like you mentioned accountability. How much of a role did accountability play early on in those small groups that Wesley was doing? What does that look like today, and are we lacking it?
Ooh. Accountability is one of those words that is just so packed. So in Wesley's day and in the days of early American Methodism, it was super toxic. There's, if I could put if I could cast my phone, I have this wonderful video. I think it's from St. George's Historic Church in Philadelphia. And it's this big box. It's probably, 4 or 5 feet long. And it has different flaps that open and little holes in the top. And then it has what looks like, an 18th century version of a chalkboard. And I was like, what is this? And the archivist there told me it was how you voted on class tickets and who would be allowed back into the class meeting. So what you would do is at the beginning of class, usually about once a quarter, you'd be handed about 12 marbles, some white, some black. And you would go up to this box and the names of your class members were written on it. And if they had been upholding the general rules, you'd put in a white marble. If you saw them at a pub instead of at church, you'd put in a black marble. And then at the end, they would open this up and tally the number of white versus black marbles and determine if you got a class ticket. And that was the system of accountability. Like that's a very toxic version of it, but I do not suggest we do that. There is, kind of in today's virtual world, there's a funny way of holding persons accountable through Zoom, where you can kind of mute people or not send them the right Zoom link. There are these types of things. But on a more serious note of how do we actually hold others accountable, for me, I don't think it's about rules and if you mess up once, you're out. And if you really and seriously look at John Wesley's general rules, that's what those weren't. Those weren't that either. They got kind of twisted and interpreted to be, if you wear gold jewelry, you don't come to a class meeting. But John Wesley, they were called general rules because they were really general. And it's just basically do no harm, do good, attend to the love of God. And as long as you're doing those things, then you are being accountable to one another. It's when we start saying, doing no harm is this, and this, and this, and this, that we start having toxic levels of accountability. So in forming these micro communities that, I think would really help rebuild United Methodism, how do we just teach people generally? Do no harm, right? Break down the systems of oppression. Do good, which doesn't mean you just do good things. It means you seek justice and you attend to the ordinances of God, right? Or in other words, take care of yourself and take care of your neighbor. Thank y'all.